Well, as Christmas gets closer, so does summer, and with summer, so does ice cream season. And with ice cream, obviously any season actually is ice cream season. But, in my family, we like to be able to pull out the sundae dishes, and like these sundae, chocolate sundae, ice cream sundaes, and get good scoops of ice cream. It's good. And lots of chocolate sauce. No, I'm already here. So it's kind of a rich dessert, isn't it? And I want today to see this as a symbol of our riches. Excuse the pun. Thinking about our money, our possession, the stuff that we have. In our passage today, in the text, it talks to a particular group of people where Paul, the apostle, is writing to his protege, Timothy, and he gives them some advice of what to teach to the rich people in the church, which is in Ephesus. In fact, this is what we read. Paul says, teach those who are rich in this world. So he's singling out a group of people symbolized today by ice cream, by kind of this rich dessert. Now, before we look at the advice he gives, I want us to kind of pause for a moment. I want you to think about what advice, if you were Paul writing to Timothy, what advice would you give to rich people, about, the riches they have? So, in fact, why don't you take a moment just to turn to the person next to you and say, what's the best advice you would give to rich people about what they have and what they should do with their stuff? Okay, 30 seconds, turn to the person next to you so you can come out with some kind of profound comment. Okay, now I didn't give you a lot of time to think about that, so I doubt whether there was any real profound comments. I'm sure next week you'll be kind of going, I wish you kind of, ask that again because I've got this really profound thing I want to tell somebody. But, today you probably just had some random comments. But what does Paul say to Timothy? Well, again, before we do that, I guess we've got to think, well, who is the people he's writing to, that he's talking to? What is this rich and non-rich? Where are the lines between this group of people known as rich and the group of people who aren't known as rich? Because it's a hard one, isn't it? Rich is always a moving target. If I asked you to put your hand up if you were rich, I doubt whether there would be many hands that would go up, if any at all. Because there's again, just hard to know about what's rich and what's non-rich. In fact, there was a study done looking at this whole thing, a Gallup study in the US. It asked people, trying to work out where this line is, asked people who earn less than $30,000 a year as a household income what they thought rich was. And for these people, it was 74,000 was the kind of the average figure that would come through in the interviews. It seemed like people took whatever they earned, doubled it, added on a little bit more, I guess, as a buffer, and that was the amount. They then spoke to the people who earned 30 to 50,000, and again, figure of 100,000 came through. I guess people doubled it, added a little bit more on. And so as they did all this research, the figure that actually came through was a household income of 120,000. Now, I'm guessing if you kind of speak to the people that earn 120,000, I'm sure, that household would go, 120,000? We're not rich. We're just getting by. Rich would be 250,000, double plus a little bit more. And they spoke to the really high earners, this Gallup poll, and then they said, well, we're not rich either, probably $5 million a year annual income. That would be rich. I guess it would be. So this rich, it's a moving target, isn't it? It's all comparative. If somebody said to you, that person over there is rich, and you go and speak to them, and they'd say, well, I'm not rich, but you should speak to my neighbor. You should see the vehicle they drive and, the house they have, and then if you speak to that person, they would be saying, no, you should speak to my client. He's like filthy rich. You see, it's all comparative, isn't it? So, when you think about ice cream, this really helps me out a lot. So I have 4 kids. And so I can, be in the kitchen and say, hey, ice cream for anyone interested. And before I'm even finished, they're right there at the kitchen bench. I can be screaming my head off about a whole bunch of other things. They seem to be deaf. I mention the word ice cream, they're right there. So, I'm there and, I give to Arwen, my eldest, to give the first Sunday. And then kind of, start getting the next Sunday ready and think I'll be a little bit more creative. So I get bigger scoops of ice cream. And some chocolate sauce again. And this time some cream. And some sprinkles. And give Chase the next one. And then, Elisha's there all waiting for his one. And because I'm in a generous, creative mood, kind of do bigger scoops again. In fact, do another one again. It's good. And some cream. Chocolate sauce over all of that this time. And the sprinkles. Okay, I might add a flake in this time too. Oh. Now, what do you think would happen in my household? Do you think my kids would say, gee, Dad, we love you so much. Thank you for the ice cream? See, Arwen would be looking at what Chase got and go, it's not fair. I don't get any cream and sprinkles. What's wrong with my one? And then Chase would look at what Elisha has and go, hey, where's my flake? You see, it's so much easier to stay with one child. Because when there's just one thing and we can't compare it, we're really happy with the ice cream and the sundae, and we're really nice and it's tasty and it's great. But then we look across and we see what someone else has, and then we see, this happens to us all the time, doesn't it? We look across the fence, somebody has kind of some sprinkles in their backyard. Somebody has, cream in what they drive, and then somebody has a real flake, further down the street. And suddenly we look at what's in our bowl, doesn't look as rich, doesn't look as good at all. It's a whole comparison trap, isn't it? But I guess it all depends on what you compare yourself to and who you compare yourself to, doesn't it? Read a story just recently about how Bill Gates visited this remote village in India. He came to this makeshift hut on some charitable work he was doing, and spoke to the lady who lived in this makeshift hut in this remote area in India. And all the journalists were there, getting the story and all that. And so they asked the lady after Bill Gates had left, hey, do you realize who's just visited you? That's Bill Gates. He's like the richest man in the world. How does that make you feel? And her answer's kind of staggering. She said, well, everyone who visits from the West is rich. Because in her mind, you and I are in the same category as Bill Gates. In her mind, the gap between where we are and where she is just so huge, it kind of just wrapped everyone in the West together. Doesn't that make you feel really good being compared to Bill Gates? It's all comparative, isn't it, how all this thing works? I went online this week to something called the Global Rich List. You can put in what you earn, and it kind of shows where you are in the global wealth of things. So I thought it would be really interesting to put the median amount that a New Zealander earns. If you remember back to your maths class, that means 100 people are more than you, 100 people less than you, right smack bang in the middle. So the figure I Googled and found from New Zealand Stats website was $32,292. It's the mean New Zealand income from all sources. Let's call it Mr. Median Kiwi or Ms. Median Kiwi, earns. And you plug that into the Global Rich List, and the percentage was this here. The top 3.38% of the richest people in the world. Staggering, isn't it? I was like, have I done that correctly? Now I'd imagine that a big chunk of people here would earn more than that. Or it might be that you earn less. You go, well, I'm just on like New Zealand super, I'm just the pension. So put that figure in too, the single retired person living alone is $19,475.56. Plug that figure in, it comes up as 13.18% of the richest people in the world. See, welcome to the lifestyle of the rich and famous. It's you and me. Now, that doesn't make you feel good, does it? You see, there's a difference between feeling rich and being rich. We typically compare ourselves to people who have more than us. They've got the cream, they've got the flake. But what do we compare ourselves to people who have less than us? More than 50% of people in the world live on less than $5 a day. Probably less than the teaspoon. When we compare ourselves with people who have more, kind of don't feel all that rich. We compare ourselves with 50% of people in the world. Suddenly we realize that we're actually doing pretty well. Now, I have to say, I realized that a chunk of people in New Zealand that are struggling financially. So we have a ministry here called CAP, Christians Against Poverty. And so as a church, we work with over 60 families who are in debt to help them get out of debt and live with freedom financially in their lives. I get this. We're a church, we don't get calls from people to say, hey, celebrate with me, I just got a pay rise. Calls come to the church when people are having a tough time. I hear lots of those stories. But comparatively, most of us here are doing pretty well by global standards. Think about some of the things we have. A free health system. Most of the world doesn't even have simple vaccinations. Education for our children is free. Most of the world has limited education. We have pensions available where people get subsidized in their retirement. We even have workplaces say to us, hey, we'd like to give you 4 weeks leave. Go and enjoy yourself. In fact, we'll pay you while you go and have a holiday. It's called holiday pay. We take it for granted. Most of the world doesn't have such things. We get Saturdays and Sundays off. Many people work 7 days a week. Many of us have houses for our cars. They're called garages. Many people in the world have very substandard housing, much better than the garages we have. So we often don't realize what we have, and we look across the fence and we see the sprinkles, we see the flake, and we're not always that content with the bowl in front of us because we're always comparing up rather than comparing down. But he said, where Paul writes to Timothy saying, I want you to teach these rich people, comparatively, he's really talking to people like you and me, isn't he? So the advice he's about to give is to people like you and me. Which raises another question. Why would he single out rich people? I mean, isn't like the Bible meant to be like for everybody? But, suddenly he's singling out a group of people, the rich, you and me, in this list. Why? I guess there's kind of challenges that rich people have that people that have really nothing don't have. Started jotting down a bit of a list here. Rich people worry a lot about Christmas presents. I mean, do I get the blue one or do I get the red one? Do I get a voucher for the person or get like a real present? What about wrapping paper? What type? And, which card? It's just stressful, isn't it? Rich person's problem. There's the stress of having, a car or two and the warrant of fitness and the registration, all these different things, and keeping it clean, keeping it working. It's a rich person's problem. Rich people worry about the food in the refrigerator, and then they go and they buy more food, and they've got no space in the refrigerator, so they have to get another one or throw some of the food out that's already there. A rich person's problem. A rich person stands at their wardrobe, and then they say, what? I have... You have that problem too. It's a rich person's problem. Rich people buy storage bins to put the stuff that they have at home because there's too much stuff in the storage bin to put it away, or even have to hire a storage facility with all the extra stuff they have. Rich person's dilemma. A rich person has to think about what happens to all their money and their stuff after they die, because it could create problems. So they pay somebody to think and help them work through all the anxiety they have about all their stuff. These are rich person's problems, because when people don't have anything, there's no problems with those things. It's going to easily fix, isn't it? So Paul writes to Timothy, and he gives some advice to rich people like you and me, to say, hey, there's some things we need to know. There's some things that this group of people need to understand. Now, I've not seen anybody really delighted at the news in the sermon thus far. I've not seen anybody kind of running around going, hey, I'm rich. This is really good. Yeah, it's not happening. Even though comparatively we're doing really well. Now, before we look at the advice, I don't want anybody to feel guilty about what we have. Because the thing is, we were born into a privileged society. What we have is largely the type of country we were born in, the type of household we grew up in. And so we, enjoy a particular way of living. But let's jump in and see what Paul's advice to Timothy, to you and me, rich people, is. There's 5 bits of advice. Here's the first couple. Teach those who are rich in this world not to be proud and not to trust in their money, which is so unreliable. So let's look at those first 2 bits of advice. First, the first bit of advice, don't be arrogant about your financial state. It might seem a bit strange to us at first, but when you have money, when you have some kind of money at your disposal, there's a status that comes with that. And with that status often becomes a sense of arrogance, a sense of being entitled to better service, being entitled to a particular say of some kind. It's a lot easier to lord it over people, to use money as a bit of a power tool, to kind of broker your way into something. And Paul's like, no, rich people need to realize you can't do that. Often it's tempting for us, isn't it, to think that the reason we have what we have is because we're smarter than other people, or because we are more hardworking. But you see, I can point to people in some poverty-stricken areas who work just as hard as many of you, if not harder, but they're still in poverty street. You see, again, we don't have to feel guilty about what we have, but much of the reason we have what we have is because of the country we were born in, the opportunities we had that other people don't have. God has blessed you with what you have. Money can lead to arrogance. And Paul says, don't do that. Second bit of advice, don't place your confidence in money. He says, teach those who are rich not to trust in their money, which is so unreliable. You see, when you look at the financial spreadsheet and the charts and things are going up and to the right and everything's where it should be, you can almost have the sense of that's the way life is always going to be. The economy is always going to grow at a 4 or 5% GDP, and households are, house prices are going to go up 20, 30% in Auckland every year. And you can almost live with this expectation that that's the way it is, and we can start to assume. We can start to place our confidence in money and our stuff. But now and again, there's reminders that actually money can't be trusted. Stock market falls, house prices, hit that bubble that people talk about. All sorts of things happen, right? And it reminds us, you can't trust money. In fact, 3,000 years ago, a very wealthy man wrote this. It's found in the Bible. His name was Solomon. He said, the rich think of their wealth as a strong defense. They imagine it. In other words, it's not real. They imagine it to be a high wall of safety. Your bank account, the stuff you have, you think this is going to be what supports you, what's going to protect you in life. And Solomon's like, no, it's imaginary. Money can't be trusted. But he goes on further in Ecclesiastes. He says, whoever loves money never has money enough. You always want more. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income. You look at your ice cream bowl and then you look to the side and there's like more sprinkles, more cream, and more, and you're not content with what you have. It says it's got to stop. That's why Paul says, don't place your confidence in money. Don't trust in money, which is so unreliable. But he goes on, their trust should be in God. You see, money's a spiritual issue. I often get a little bit nervous talking about money in a church context until really I have to keep coming back to this part to realize money is a spiritual issue. We have to talk about this. That's why Jesus often spoke more about money and possessions than he did about heaven and hell. Because money is a spiritual issue. It has everything to do with faith, hope, and love. And so we can either place all that on money and think that's going to provide for us and do all that, or we place it on God. So that's why Paul's giving this advice to rich people, saying, almost say to ourselves, I make my money does not make me. As a Jesus follower, it's not what I possess, but who possesses me that's at the core of my being. So Paul begins with this 2 bits of advice. Don't be arrogant about your financial state. Don't place your confidence in money. And then he goes on and gives 3 more bits of advice, more on the positive side, things that we're meant to do with our money. The first one might surprise you. Enjoy what you have. Paul says their trust should be in God, who richly gives us all we need for our, say it, enjoyment. I think a lot of us would almost expect it to stop after the word need, full stop. God gives us everything we need. But Paul wants to highlight for our enjoyment. God wants us to enjoy what we have. Then when we're sitting out on the deck watching the sunset, or you're out, on a sandy beach on vacation somewhere, when you're riding your new truck, when you have the bowl of ice cream and that flake in front of you, enjoy it. Hear your Creator whisper to you, enjoy this. Don't feel guilty about it because God is the one who's provided what you have. Again, don't be overconfident in what you have. Don't find your identity in it, but enjoy what you have. And then I think as you're sitting there, hearing your Creator say to you, enjoy this, I think if you said to God, God, is there something you want me to do with the stuff you've entrusted to me? I think you'd also hear the rest of this advice. He says, tell them to use their money to do good. They should be rich in good works and generous to those in need, always being ready to share with others. There's 2 other bits of advice that come through there: to serve generously and to share generously. Let me pick up on those and just talk to them for a bit. To serve generously. Sometimes people, think about greed and consumerism and the way those things can affect us, and think the answer to combating greed in our lives is by focusing more on this and just trying not to do it. I think what Paul's doing here is he gives us advice about how to deal with this in our lives is what serving is a really good antidote to not think about greed and consumerism, but to actually think about the needs of other people. But when we serve, here at GCC or other places in the community, we jump in and we start to think about the needs of other people rather than my own. And when I do that in a routine way, in a ongoing way, my heart becomes more concerned about others. And subtly but slowly, consumerism and greed becomes less of a hold on my life. And gratitude and joy, the needs of others becomes more paramount in my life. Don't underestimate the ability that the gracious, humble service has to reshape the attitudes that you need to have towards yourself and others. Serve generously. The final bit of advice is that share generously. I'm sure when you chatted to somebody else earlier about, well, what do you do with, the ice cream when you've kind of, they're giving advice to rich people? I'm sure many of you said something about sharing it. Sometimes people might think the advice of the Bible is just to give it all away. God says enjoy it, but also to share it. Just release the hold of some of that and share it with other people. And once again, this isn't just because of the needs that exist in our city or our world. We don't just share because of the need that exists. We don't just share because we want to make a difference in people's lives, even though that's all true. We share and we give generously because it helps us. See, the best antidote towards dealing with the greed and consumerism of our life is to have this faithful, generous, consistent pattern of giving, sharing generously with other people. And little bit by little bit, the stronghold that the money can have in my life and in your life becomes less and less and less as we think again about the needs of other people. You know, one thing I've noticed as a pastor is that when people tend to ignore the crystal clear direction God gives about money, often they're more likely to also ignore the other things God says about life. They're not as quick to forgive, not as quick to apologize, not as quick to, obey God in a whole bunch of other areas in life. Opposite's also true. When people step in and listen to God's crystal clear direction about what to do with our stuff, kind of train their heart to listen to God and respond to His prompting in a whole bunch of different areas of life. That's why I want this value of generosity to be imprinted in our DNA. Now, I doubt that anybody here wants to be known as a stingy, miserly person. I think every single one of us wants to be known as a generous person. I think our intention is always to be generous. But what I've noticed as a pastor is that people often have this intention of being generous, but when they look at their situation, it's always, well, later. I'll come to that later when I can and when my situation changes. And so it might say something like, I really want to be a generous person, a person known with deep generosity, but just not now. You see, I'm graduating from university soon, and I've got all this student debt. Once I've paid off my debt, then I'll start to, I'll get started in my career, and I'll be earning something, and then I fully intend to be a consistent, generous giver. But later, and they mean it, and 5 years passes. I fully intend to manage my resources to serve my church in a significant way and alleviate suffering in the world, but just got married, and we're saving for our first home. I'll get to the generosity later. Months become years, and our children toddling around the house, and our spending is dominated by mortgage and cars and toys and clothes, and later just keeps getting further delayed. Those small children grow up. We buy a bigger house. We buy bigger toys. There's hobbies to fund. There's school supplies. Later. And we look at our retirement savings, and they're not as large as we had anticipated or wanted them to be, and I guess later when we've got enough. You see, even today, you might be thinking, I've got to talk about this, hear this today, and Christmas is just around the corner. What is it, 39 days or whatever that was? And you just think, after Christmas, then I'll think about this. And then the new year, suddenly it's like school supplies and school uniforms and school fees. It's always later. And we genuinely want to be generous. It's just later. The well-intentioned follower of Jesus who genuinely wanted to be generous awakens after decades have passed to discover that really later, in reality, meant no. So generosity begins now, not later. Regardless of the season of life, regardless of season of the year. As your pastor, I want you to be known for your generosity. I want people to know us as a church, a Green Lane Christian Center, as a generous church that is embedded in our DNA. And we are a generous church, but to see that kind of grow, to see that develop, to see that trait in us blossoming. Now, I would imagine some of you here are a bit cynical about money in relation to church. We've all heard of kind of that story or whatever that story took place in, but how, that church and that money, they didn't always go together, did they? So we work really hard here at how we spend things and the accountability for that money. But, if you're still on the cynical side of where church and money come together, I don't think you're off the hook. Just give somewhere else. It doesn't have to be here. Just round something that fits with God's purposes in the world. But be generous with what you have. Allow God to do something, not just in the lives of other people making a difference, but in your life, to release the hold that money can have. So as your pastor, I want you to take steps forward in this area. Some of you give, zero to next to nothing, or maybe just from time to time when you hear a message like this, or you hear about some need, you might kind of open your wallet and give like a 5 or a 10 and feel good about that. Why don't you take it to the next step and think about giving like 1 or 2% of your income towards causes that God cares about in the world? Or it might be that you've been doing that for a while. Why not think about the tithe as a good benchmark? 10% of your income. It's a healthy way to live. Or it might be that you've been doing that for a while. Grow in this area. Develop it further. 11%, 12%, 15%, whatever is possible for you. Or it might be that you've been at that level for a while, but your income's gone up, with different increases, but you've never really adjusted an automatic payment. You might have set up years ago for whatever cause. Why not step into that? Seize the opportunity. Or perhaps you're one of those unique people that have a gift the Bible would call a gift of giving. Or perhaps you have even extra resources at your disposal. You're more like a flake person. Not flaky, but have a flake. If you're that kind of person and you'd like to seed new opportunities, for kingdom work, Brian and I would just love to chat to you. We always have ideas about things that we would love to see happen here and throughout New Zealand. But often it's just seeds that just need to be planted through finance and allowing things to develop. But you might want to ask and think about some different stories, some different opportunities to be part of. Now, if you do that, I would imagine if you decided, I want to start giving like 10% of my income, and you go home and you work out what you have, and then you're suddenly setting up this automatic payment to give, X percentage and all that, and you look at it. So it might be, you earn 60,000 and you see 6,000 a year that I'm giving. Like, really? What tends to happen is mentally we start thinking about all the things we can do with that money. The holiday we can have, flat screen TV we can buy, all these other things that need some attention. It's really easy to get directed from that. That's where later always comes into it, because there's always something else. But if we're going to step into this and be a generous person, listening to the crystal clear directions God gives to rich people, it begins now with stepping in with generosity. Out in the foyer, there's a book, we've got a few copies of this, called Fields of Gold by Andy Stanley. It's a book we give to people when they've kind of just begun giving. Here, send a letter and a book, this one. There's a few others out there, though, too. And so they're about $5 or $6 each for us as a church. Just grab them for free. And as long as you read it, feel free to pass it on to other people, too. Just helpful book. Just if you want to think more about this and what it might look like in your life, there's just some at the reception counter afterwards. Paul finishes his advice to rich people with these words. By doing this, they will be storing up their treasure. By doing what? But by following the advice that he's just given. Don't be arrogant about your financial state. Don't place confidence in money. Enjoy it. Serve generously. Share generously. But by following this, rich people will be storing up their treasure as a good foundation for the future, so they may experience true life. So when I think about it, because ice cream and money have a few things in common. If you just kind of hoard it and keep it, it doesn't look all that great after a while, does it? It's not meant to just kind of sit there. Tubs just kind of melt away, get slushy. That slush fund isn't meant to just be slushy. It's meant to be shared, that other people can enjoy what God has given to us. Let's pray together. Father, thank you that we have so much to enjoy in this country. Cars we have, place we rent or live in, food we eat, health, education, the lawn we mow and often moan about mowing. Thank you for all of these things. Help us to be full of gratitude for what we have, to enjoy it as a gift from you. But help us not to find our identity in these things. Help us to find our identity in the way you see us as your children. And help us to not hoard what we have in some tub that ultimately just melts away. Help us to share it and to find joy in the process. In Jesus' name, amen.